Word up, word up. How's it going, folks? Professor Rex here. I'm a professor of mathematics and statistics and probability theory, and I thought it'd be a great idea to do a podcast about words. Yeah, because that makes sense. Actually, kind of does. I watch a lot of podcasts, and some folks use a lot of big words, and I write them down on a piece of paper, and then I never look them up. So I figured there might be other folks like myself who are interested in these words, but a little bit on the lazy side. So I'm going to share these words with you in the definitions and a little example use. And the first podcast we're going to dissect this episode is the Whitney Cummings podcast. Good for you. Good for you. Really great podcast. She's a very smart lady, uses lots of big words, has great guests. And every once in a while, some of her guests do call her out on using some big words. For example, here is Rick Glassman calling her out.
I didn't realize if someone's stoned, you're not allowed to talk about it. Because you're not ostensibly stoned. You probably get more clear and just more confident. Now, become a better version of yourself.
By ostensibly, what does that word mean?
And then here's an example of Yanis Pappas, not necessarily calling her out, but just sort of complimenting her on her large vocabulary.
Okay, so you have the dubious honor of being someone I call a real friend.
Yeah,
whether
you're
you
smart,
like it or
you
not.
got a good vocabulary.
Huh.
And here's some clips of Whitney using a bunch of words that I'm not familiar with.
Beguiling and heads are like Pangea plates. Yeah. Is it like an anhedonia thing? Ethereal, more of a bifurcation, truculent, impish arc, some modicum of this is circuitous, fine. That's and titillating. And is it like an anhedonia thing? Anything in the zeitgeist
We're not going to be able to get to all of those words this episode. We're only going to get to 10 words. My favorite word in that list is anhedonia. I'd never heard that word in my life. So we're going to get to that word this episode. But before we get started, here's a quick little story. So my friend, she was working on her SNL, her Saturday Night Live packet. When you're trying to become a writer there, you got to submit 6 sketches. So she was working on her SNL packet, and she had about 5 completed, and she had sent them to me for notes, and she just needed 1 more. And I jokingly said to her, I said, why don't you send in that 1 sketch that you wrote when you won LA's Dirtiest Sketch Contest? So back in the day at the UCB Theater, they used to have LA's Dirtiest Sketch Contest, and people would just write crazy, filthy sketches, and then the audience would vote on it. So my friend, many years ago, she and some girlfriend had written some crazy sketch, and they won. And so I was suggesting to her to just, as a joke, to just use that sketch. And she's like, ha, 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 ha. And then I said, that girl that you did that sketch with, I go, whatever happened to her? She was really cute. And my friend, she says, are you joking? I'm like, what? She's like, are you joking me? And I'm like, what? She goes, you know who that was? And I'm like, no, who was that? She goes, that was Whitney. And I was like, oh, okay. So I guess technically, Whitney, I met you many, many years ago. And then I said you were really, really cute. Hey, okay. So that's I've met Whitney before story.
Are we friends?
2 of Whitney's favorite words are pathologize and ostensibly. Pathologize and ostensibly. She uses them quite a lot. I have my notes here just in case I need to reference something.
Having super hearing and super sensitivities, that was probably really valuable before we, and now it's pathologized is crazy, psycho, annoying.
So pathologize. So I thought I understood what the word pathologize meant. Pathology is sort of like a disease. So I assumed it's when you call something a disease. But good thing I looked it up. So Whitney uses the word correctly. She usually does. So pathologize. So I thought it was when you just call something a disease, but there's a little bit more to it. Pathologize, to unfairly or wrongly consider something or someone as a problem. So to incorrectly, unfairly, or wrongly consider it a disease. Okay, so example. Until 2013, sadomasochism, along with fetishism, was pathologized as a mental illness in the DSM. The DSM, by the way, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. Okay, so pathologize. Excellent word. I'm glad I looked it up. Whitney's been using it correctly. I did not know the correct definition or usage of the word, so thank you, Whitney. And the other word she uses a lot is ostensibly.
About when things that are ostensibly like limitations in someone's life. I didn't realize if someone's stoned, you're not allowed to talk about it. Because like you're not ostensibly stoned. You probably get like more clear.
Okay, so ostensibly, it seemed as it's sort of obviously, but it's not obviously. So ostensibly, you're a nice guy versus obviously, you're a nice guy. So ostensibly, it means according to what is apparent or declared, supposedly, purportedly, seemingly. So notice the difference between obviously he's a nice guy versus ostensibly he's a nice guy. So ostensibly he's a nice guy. A little bit of skepticism. It's like, well, based on what I see, what I've heard, ostensibly he's a nice guy. Interesting. So pathologize and ostensibly. And what is our next word, Whitney?
So you have the dubious honor of being someone I call a real friend.
Yeah,
whether
you're
you
smart.
like it or
You
not.
got a good vocabulary.
Huh.
You do.
The next word is dubious. And I kind of have a feeling for what the word dubious means. And so that's why I thought Whitney actually used the word incorrectly. It turns out she did not use the word incorrectly. So she was telling Yanis Pappas, and Yanis Pappas actually pointed out after she said this that he feels like she has a very large vocabulary. So she said he had the dubious honor of being a real friend. And I thought, I'm like, oh wait, dubious. I think like she used that incorrectly. So I actually looked that word up. So dubious is feeling or showing doubt or uncertainty, skeptical, unsure, hesitant. So it seemed like she was using it incorrectly. But then I actually Googled the full expression, dubious honor. So it turns out dubious honor is an expression in and of itself. Aha. So thus Whitney used it correctly. So a dubious honor is the supposed honor of being selected to do a difficult or unpopular task, or the supposed honor associated with receiving a questionable award. Okay, so dubious honor of being a real friend. That makes sense. Okay, so here's an example of it being used. So the supposed honor of being selected to do a difficult or unpopular task. Let's see. Oh, I have the dubious honor of being in charge of fundraising for the roof repair on the town gymnasium. So it's an honor to be tasked, yet it's something unwanted. Okay, so dubious honor. So 1 point Whitney, 0 points Rex. Good job, Whitney. So when she did say the dubious honor, what I thought, I'm like, oh wait, maybe she meant to say like dutiful or maybe indubious. So indubious means, I had to look this up, certain or doubtless, and dutiful means motivated by duty rather than desire or enthusiasm. So I thought she meant to say the dutiful honor or the indubious. And then on a side note, indubious is kind of a fun word. So maybe you remember, if you are a little bit older, Saturday mornings used to be full of cartoons and they had all kinds of weird commercials. And there's this one commercial for a cereal called Crispy Critters, and they used the words indubitably. So the song went something like this. Oh yeah, no, it's Crispy Critters. How do you do? New Crispy Critters cereal is coming for you. And then he points at the little girl. This is a cartoon line. It's indubitably. And then the little girl goes, indubitably. He goes, indubitably. And then the little girl goes, indubitably delicious. So indubitably is just a derivative of indubious, certain or doubtless. See? Whitney's word dubious led to us learning the new word indubious and indubitably. So thank you for that. Oh, I brought up Rick Glassman for calling out Whitney for using big words. And I have a Rick Glassman story. So before I go further, let me just say I think Rick Glassman is hilarious. His podcast, Take Your Shoes Off, is hilarious. I think he's an amazing guest on other people's podcasts. I've never seen a stand-up, but I'm sure he's really hilarious. So Rick, you're very funny. Now, having said all that, many years ago, I met Rick Glassman at a party, unfortunately. I think he went by the Rickster. I'm assuming this is Rick Glassman. I'm pretty sure it is. I asked my buddy to confirm it was, and it was. So he went by the Rickster, and I distinctly remember meeting him because he was the worst human being I'd ever met in my entire life. But if you watch Rick Glassman on his podcast or other podcasts, he explains how he doesn't really understand social cues. So that might explain why I found him to be such a horrible human being. But remember, Rick, I think you're very funny and a great podcaster. Okay, that was my Rick Glassman story. Okay, well, what's the next word, Whitney?
The holidays really freak me out. Like once Christmas Eve comes around.
Can you be specific? Is it like an anhedonia thing? Like I have trouble enjoying something because I know it's going to be over soon?
The word I promised you in the very beginning. Now, Whitney pronounces it anhedonia, which I think sounds way cooler. Maybe because the first time I heard the word was when Whitney said it, anhedonia. So when I looked it up on Google and you click correct pronunciation, it says anhedonia, anhedonia.
Anhedonia. Anhedonia.
So anhedonia sounds better, but apparently it's anhedonia, anhedonia, anhedonia. Okay, so anhedonia, cool word. I can't believe I've never heard this before. Inability to experience pleasure in activities that are usually considered enjoyable. And then they give you some synonyms. And then there's nothing worse when they give you a synonym and then you don't know what that word means. So they say distress, D-O-L-O-R, like color, both the D. So I had to look that up.
Dolor. Dolor.
Dolor, dolor. So distress, dolor, dysphoria, heartache, infelicity, melancholy, misfortune, worry, wretchedness. And then they give you a little example sentence. And the example sentence usually clarifies everything. Due to her depression, Sarah experienced anhedonia and lost interest in her hobbies. Okay, anhedonia. Interesting. Inability to experience pleasure in activities that are usually considered enjoyable. Awesome word. And then I had to look up that D-O-L-O-R, looks like color, but spelled with the letter D. Pronounced dolor, dolor. A state of great sorrow or distress. Okay. I might use the word, actually if I use anhedonia, I'd probably say anhedonia. It'd be weird to say anhedonia. So good work, Whitney. Maybe we can get that word changed, the pronunciation. Anhedonia. Okay, so dolor. I'll probably never use dolor in a sentence. If I see it though, I'd probably have to look it up again. Okay. Anhedonia. Oh, so the cool thing about how she mispronounced the word, someone pointed out to me, maybe it was on the internet or a friend, I can't remember, but they said, oh, if someone mispronounces a word, like that's awesome. That means that they taught themselves, like they learned that word through reading. Like oftentimes we get words from other people talking to us. So if you mispronounce a word, that means you learned that word on your own from reading. You're self-educated. So I have a quick little story about that. My buddy, he's a computer programmer. He's awesome. He builds companies, sells them, very successful. And we're talking about this website he was working on. Now, on a side note, if you line up in America, we say it's like you're standing in line. But in Britain, they say you're queuing up or you're in the queue.
Queue. Queue.
So Q-U-E-U-E is a queue. So in computer programming, if you have data in a list, you call that a queue. So I was talking to my buddy, the really successful programmer guy, and he kept using the word queue. He's like, oh yeah, we got to throw the data into a queue. And then I'm like, wait, what, a queue? What are you talking about? And he's like, queue, Q-U-E-U-E. And I go, oh, a queue is pronounced Q, which is really awesome considering how successful it is that you go, wait a second, clearly you never studied computer programming at university level. You're completely self-taught. So very impressive. So we should be impressed sometimes when people mispronounce words. Oh, that same buddy. Here's something weird. According to the internet, about 30 to 50%, I don't even know where they get this information from, 30 to 50% don't have an inner monologue or an internal monologue. So when you think, at least when I think, and half of the world, you can kind of hear a voice in your head. So that's your inner monologue or your internal monologue. Apparently, 30 to 50% of people don't have this inner or internal monologue. So I don't know what's happening in their head. So my buddy, the computer programmer, here's what's weird. I couldn't find data on this. The voice in my head is my voice. My buddy, the computer programmer, says the voice is not his voice. Should I be concerned? I'm not sure. So let me know in the comments if you have your own, if you have a voice and if it's yours or someone else's. I think if it's someone else's, that's a little weird. Oh, and while we're on that topic, I have another buddy. Let me see what it's called. Oh, so he can't visualize things in his head. So if you say apple, I can picture an apple in my head, okay? So I thought everyone could do that, just like having an internal monologue. So this one day I was talking with my buddy and we're about to meet up with a friend we hadn't seen in forever. And I'm like, oh my God, I go, the brain is so amazing. Like, we haven't seen her in like, a decade, but I can picture her perfectly. And he's like, what do you mean? I go, well, I could just visualize her. He's like, what? And he had no idea what I was talking about. And he thought I was messing with him. So he calls up his wife and he's like, hey, like, if I say something, can you visualize it? She's like, yeah. He's like, are you messing with me? She's like, no. He's like, okay, so if I say like Tom Cruise, you can just picture Tom Cruise. And she's like, yeah. And he's like, oh my God, I think I can't do that. And she's like, what? She's like, well, you can picture me, can't you, babe? He's like, no. And she's like, well, you can picture the kids, can't you? And he's like, no. So that inability to visualize, that's called aphantasia, aphantasia, aphantasia. And apparently only 2 to 5% of the world experiences that. And also with this aphantasia, apparently there's sort of a spectrum of ability to visualize. So some people, let's say apple, some people can kind of visualize an apple, whereas some people can totally visualize a crisp apple and like spin it in 3 dimensions. So I'm sort of on that far side. I can visualize pretty much anything really well. So when I meet someone who can't visualize anything, it just boggles my mind. I don't even know how they think. So if you don't have an internal monologue and if you can't visualize, I just don't even understand what thinking would mean to you. Okay. Next word, Whitney. What's the next word?
It's like I just had PTSD around growing up with women that were mercurial and scared me. And
mercurial, like mercury, mercurial. Again, a word I often hear, but I would never use. I kind of have a feeling for what it means. Like Mercury is like really, it's the fastest. Mercury is the closest one to the sun, so it goes really fast. So kind of quick. Okay, I don't know what it means. So I had to look it up. Mercurial. Mercurial describes someone whose mood or behavior is changeable and unpredictable, or someone who is clever, lively, and quick. Okay. With a mercurial teacher, did I pronounce that correctly?
Mercurial.
With a mercurial, such a weird word. With a mercurial teacher, you never know where you stand. Mercurial. Okay. They can be very mercurial. 1 minute docile, the next skittish. Mercurial. Which got me thinking about mercury. So you may remember from chemistry, the element symbol for mercury is Hg. So it's a little weird. So I looked it up on the Googles, and it turns out that the name for mercury in Greek is hydrogyrum. So hydor, meaning water, like hydra, hydor, meaning water, and silver is argyros. So you put them together, and you get hydrogyrum. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Hydrogyrum. So I guess that just straight up means water silver or silver water. So if you've ever played with mercury, it's just like liquid, silvery, heavy. It's like that guy in Terminator 2, it's sort of that silverish liquid. So liquid silver, hydrogyrum. And then another word for mercury is quicksilver. So quicksilver comes from the Old English where quiok, silver meaning silver, quiok meaning alive or moving. So that quiok turned into quick, so quicksilver. And then you may be familiar with the brand, the cool surf brand Quicksilver, but notice that they spell it without the C. So Quicksilver, the brand, the surfing stuff is just Q-U-I-K. Okay, but Quicksilver with a C spelled out is another way of saying mercury, the metal, the liquid silver stuff. Excellent. Okay, Whitney, what's our next word?
but it was like, what's like the offensive word to use for gay man in sign language?
Yeah.
Like what's queer, like what's pejorative for gay man? And I think it was this.
Pejorative. That's a word I use sometimes, but I'm not really sure if I'm using it correctly. So I looked it up, and it's expressing disapproval or contempt, derogatory, disparaging, belittling. Okay, so I think I've been using it correctly. That's a really good word. The politician used pejorative language to attack his opponent. Okay, so that got me thinking about the word. I always get it mixed up. So pejorative, like, it's like, oh, that's a pejorative, like, oh, that's a bad word, like almost like a racial slur, sort of. But then I'm like, oh, wait, there's a word for racial slur. And I always get it mixed up. It's like epithet, I don't know, something weird. So I always mix these words up. There's epitaph, and then there's epithet. So the racial slur epithet is a word. So epithet is the offensive word or name that is used in a way of abusing or insulting someone. So like, many were offended by her use of racial epithets. Okay, so epithet was the racial slur. So instead of saying racial slur, you could just say they were using epithets. Okay, or racial epithets, I guess, to be more specific. So I feel like the word epithet has mostly been used lately, that I've been noticing, to mean sort of like a slur or something, a group of angry people hurling epithets at one another. But it turns out that epithet doesn't have only a pejorative meaning. See, I just used the word pejorative. So epithet, I guess, also has the sort of first meaning is a word or phrase that describes a person or thing. So for example, his charitable work have earned him the epithet Mr. Philanthropy. His charitable works have earned him the epithet Mr. Philanthropy. So you see how there's nothing bad about the word epithet? It's just a word or phrase that describes a person or thing. So there's two meanings. It's either just that, a word or phrase that describes a person or thing, or an offensive word or name that is used as a way of abusing or insulting someone. So be careful with the word epithet. I guess it has sort of two meanings. One, pejorative. Okay, and then epitaph I just randomly brought up because I can never remember if it's epithet or epitaph. But here's a easy way, probably not easy for me. Epitaph. So there's Epitaph Records. So Epitaph Records is the Bad Religion band. That's their record label. So an epitaph is what's written on the tombstone. So words written in memory of a person, especially an inscription on a tombstone. Okay, so an epitaph. So in my mind, at least, my mnemonic is, okay, Epitaph Records, Bad Religion. Okay, that's the stuff that's written on the tombstone. So therefore, the other things got to be the sort of bad words. So epithet. I don't think I'd ever use epithet. That's such a weird word, epithet. I don't think I'd ever use that when I'm talking. But if someone were to use it, I think I would clearly understand its meaning. And what is our next word, Whitney?
Is sort of transmogrified into like the superpowers. Transmogrify.
Now that is a fancy word.
Transmogrify.
I thought the word she was going for was, I've seen this word a long time ago. It's when you turn, when in the Catholic religion, when the priest holds up the bread and turns the bread into the body of Christ. So there's like I thought the word was transmogrify, when the bread turns into the body of Christ. So there's a fancy word for that, and I thought that's what she was going for. In my mind, I'm like, oh, why not just use the word transform? But she used the word transmogrify. I wasn't sure she was just being sort of, hyperbolic in that use of the word. So I looked up transmogrify. So transmogrify, to change completely in appearance or character. Okay, so I guess she used it correctly. And I'm like, well, why not just use the word transform? So I just sort of looked up like transform versus transmogrify. Aha. So transform means to change greatly the appearance of form. Okay. Whereas transmogrify means to completely alter the form of. Huh? So then they give a little example which really clarifies things. Transmogrify suggests a strange or preposterous metamorphosis, a story in which a frog is transmogrified into a prince. Oh, okay. So if this guy cleans up a little bit and gets a haircut and, dresses nice, he could transform into Brad Pitt. But a frog, you give it a kiss, it transmogrifies into a prince. Okay, so transmogrify is not just going from like here to here, it's like going from here to wackadoodle over here. Okay, transmogrify. Interesting. So that's a fancy word that I will probably never use. I'm trying to think if someone else uses it. I think I can remember if someone else uses it, what it means. I don't know if I would ever use that word myself. But then I had to look up what word I was thinking of to begin with that I thought she was going for, that whole turning the Catholic bread into the body of Christ. So I looked up that word, and that word is transubstantiation. Ooh, interesting word. So transubstantiation, that is when you turn the bread at the ceremony into the body of Christ. Transubstantiation. Now, here's an interesting story about transubstantiation. So apparently back in the medieval times when the priest would do this, they would hold the bread above their head and then they would say in Latin, "This is my body." And how you say "this is my body" is hoc est corpus. Hoc est corpus. This is my body. And that sort of turned into transformed. I don't know if I want to say transmortified. Let's just say transformed. Transformed into hocus pocus. So hoc est corpus turned into hocus pocus. And we all know hocus pocus, which is usually associated with the stuff that magicians do, or I guess the recurring word here is pejorative, or the pejorative sense of hocus pocus, where it's sort of a sleight of hand, sort of nonsense or sham used especially to cloak deception. Okay, so hocus pocus coming from the transubstantiation. Okay, and you know, we just learned 10 or 12 new words. Let's pause right there. If we get enough views, we'll do some more episodes. Some words we didn't get to. What were some words we didn't get to, Whitney? Let's hear what those words are.
I'll be like, I was kind of nefarious. People are like, no, tall poppy syndrome type of louder, gesticulating more. Confluence of habit with the cognitive dissonance of people.
Next episode, if there is a next episode, we will either continue with some Whitney words. We have about 20 more Whitney words. Or we'll move on to another podcast. Maybe we could try out the Tim Dillon podcast, see which big words he's using. I actually saw Tim Dillon walking down the boardwalk a couple days ago. I was walking and he was walking the other way with some guy. And Tim Dillon's actually really tall. And as I got closer and I recognized it was him, I just sort of pointed at him and I go, "Tim Dillon." And he didn't even look at me. He just, as he's passing me, just says, "Hey, buddy." And so that's my Tim Dillon story. Okay, so episode 2, hopefully we will have an episode 2. Subscribe, put a comment, put some words we should check out, some podcasters who use big words. Okay, hopefully people enjoy this and I will do more. This was just a first episode. Oh, also, hopefully I'm playing right now that little theme song that was made using AI. Pretty impressive, eh? Word up, word up. Okay, I'm Professor Rex. It's been fun hanging out with you folks. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to leave a comment. You folks are all awesome. Peace. Bye.
Word up with Rex. Talk about nothing. Learn stuff about words. Hit the subscribe button. Word up. Word up.
Like, I don't think that the gift giving has to be congruous. Pretty good word.